Daniel pulled his old jacket tighter around his shoulders, the wooden planks beneath him groaning under his shifting weight. The wind carried a chill, whispering through the skeletal branches of the trees beyond his porch. He exhaled slowly, watching his breath dissolve into the night air. The silence was thick, too thick, the kind that made his skin prickle with unease. He had spent years in solitude, but tonight something felt different, as if the night itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. His eyes narrowed as a movement in the abandoned field caught his attention. There, beneath the pale glow of the moon, a shadow darted through the overgrown grass. A dog. Not just any dog. A German shepherd, its form lean and ragged, fur matted from neglect. Daniel had noticed it before, always lurking near the same spot, its paws clawing at the hardened earth with a desperate urgency. Night after night it returned, repeating the same ritual. It wasn't just wandering, it was searching. But for what, and why couldn't it let go? Tonight, the animal's movements were more frantic than ever. Its front paws slammed against the dirt, shoving the earth aside in panicked bursts. Its body trembled from exhaustion, ribs pressing sharply against its thin frame. But it refused to stop. Every few moments it would pause, nose buried in the disturbed soil, whimpering as if urging something, someone, to respond. Daniel leaned forward, watching, an unfamiliar tightness forming in his chest. He had seen desperation before, in the eyes of those who had lost everything, and now he saw it again in this lone, suffering creature. A strange feeling crept over him, that look in the dog's eyes. It was too familiar, the way it clung to this one place, as if it had nowhere else to go, no one else to turn to. It mirrored something in himself, something he had long stopped acknowledging. Loneliness. The kind that settled into your bones and refused to leave. The kind that made you keep searching, even when you didn't know what you were searching for. His fingers curled against the rough wood of the railing. For the first time in years, he felt something other than emptiness. Daniel's grip tightened. He could go over there, see what the dog was after. But an old voice in his head warned him against it. He had spent years avoiding trouble, keeping to himself, letting the world pass by. This wasn't his problem, and yet he couldn't look away. The dog's whimpers reached his ears, and something inside him shifted. He could ignore it, go inside, pretend he hadn't seen a thing. Or he could do something he hadn't done in a long time, step forward. The decision weighed heavily. And then he moved. Daniel inhaled sharply, forcing his feet to move forward. The cold air stings his face as he steps off the porch and into the field. The dog stiffens instantly, its muscles tensing as a deep, warning growl rumbles from its throat. Daniel freezes, hands half raised in surrender. But despite its defensive stance, the dog's eyes betray something else: fear, exhaustion. "I'm not here to hurt you," he murmurs, his voice low, measured. The dog lowers its head slightly, ears pinned back. It doesn't trust him. Not yet. But Daniel sees it now. This isn't aggression. It's desperation. In the dim light, Daniel can see the dog more clearly. Its ribs press against its thin frame, its fur clumped with dirt and dried mud. Every breath it takes is labored, its legs trembling beneath its weight. The dog isn't just lost, it's starving. A pang of guilt twists in Daniel's chest. How long has it been like this? How long has it been alone? The dog's gaze flickers toward him, wary, exhausted. Then, slowly, it resumes digging, its frail body pushing through sheer will. "You're looking for something," Daniel mutters. He doesn't know what, but he knows one thing for sure. It won't survive much longer like this. Daniel doesn't push, he knows better. Instead, he steps back toward the porch, moving slow and deliberately. Inside, he rummages through his kitchen, hands shaking slightly as he sets a plate with leftover chicken and a slice of bread. Stepping back outside, he places the plate near the edge of the porch. The dog doesn't move. It watches him, muscles tense, eyes darting between him and the food. Daniel doesn't linger. He retreats inside, standing by the window, his breath fogging the glass. Now, he waits. By morning, the plate is empty, but something else catches Daniel's attention. The dog is still there. Not on the porch, not by the food, but back in the field digging, the same spot. Daniel rubs a hand over his face. What the hell are you looking for? The dog's paws scrape tirelessly at the hardened earth, its body swaying from exhaustion. And yet, it refuses to stop. It isn't just surviving, it's searching. Daniel isn't sure why, but the thought chills him. The next night, the dog is back. Same field, same spot, same frantic, desperate movements. Daniel watches from the porch, arms crossed tightly over his chest. The air bites through his flannel, but he barely notices. Each night, the same ritual repeats. The dog digs, Daniel leaves food, the dog eats, but never stops searching. The cycle continues for days, an unspoken understanding forming between them. Daniel doesn't know why, but he feels it. Whatever the dog is looking for, it's important. And deep down, he knows he won't be able to ignore it much longer. Tonight is different. The dog pauses, its paws slowing as if it's finally reached something. Daniel moves before he can second-guess himself. He crosses the field, kneeling beside the hole. The dog stiffens but doesn't move away. Slowly, hesitantly, Daniel brushes dirt aside. His fingers hit something solid. Wood. His pulse quickens. It's not a root, it's not a rock, it's something buried. The dog whines softly beside him, pacing anxiously. Daniel swallows, heart hammering. Whatever this is, it matters. Daniel exhales shakily, brushing away more dirt. The wooden surface beneath his fingers feels rough, old. His mind races with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. The dog paces beside him, letting out another sharp whimper, as if urging him forward. "What did you find?" he mutters. His fingers curl under the edge, trying to lift whatever it is. It doesn't budge, it's buried deep. The realization sends a shiver down his spine. Whatever lies beneath this earth, the dog has been trying to reach it for days. And now, Daniel has no choice but to uncover the truth. Daniel moved cautiously, kneeling a safe distance from the dog. He placed a fresh plate of food on the porch, his voice low and soothing. "You don't have to run," he murmured, watching the dog's wary eyes track his every move. The dog, still nameless, didn't approach immediately. Instead, it stood stiffly, ears flicking forward, then back, uncertain. Hunger gnawed at its frail body, but fear held it back. Daniel didn't push. He simply sat on the steps, watching, waiting. The night deepened, and finally, the dog crept forward, snatching mouthfuls of food before retreating. A fragile, unspoken agreement was forming. The dog didn't trust him, not yet, but it was no longer running, and that was enough for now. Days passed, each one marked by the same quiet routine. Food left on the porch, distance maintained. The dog lingered now, never close enough to touch, but never too far. It followed Daniel's movements, a silent shadow weaving through the trees, always watching. "Shadow," Daniel whispered one morning, testing the name aloud. It fit, the way the dog moved, the way it stayed near but never too close. Shadow didn't react, but something in its posture softened. "You like that, huh?" Daniel chuckled. The name stuck, even if Shadow never acknowledged it. In some small way, The dog was becoming his. One afternoon, Daniel drove Shadow to the nearest vet clinic, hoping for answers. "No microchip," the vet said, scanning again just to be sure. "No collar, no markings that suggest an owner. If this dog had a home, it's been lost for a while." Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "So it just showed up out of nowhere?" The vet nodded. "It happens. Strays get abandoned, or they run off looking for something or someone." Shadow sat stiffly beside him, uninterested in the conversation. But as soon as they returned home, the ritual continued. The digging, always in the same spot. What had Shadow lost? Or worse, what had it left behind? Thunder rumbled in the distance, rain battering the windows as Daniel stoked the fireplace. A sudden scratching at the door made him freeze. Shadow. The dog never approached the house, never willingly. But now, wet fur clung to its thin frame, ears pinned back against the storm. Daniel hesitated. If he opened the door, would Shadow run? Or worse, would it bolt inside, only to regret it? He took a breath and unlatched the door. Shadow didn't move at first. Then, with quiet resolve, it stepped over the threshold, water pooling beneath its paws. Daniel stood still, heart pounding. This wasn't just about shelter. Shadow had chosen to come in, to trust him. For the first time, the dog wasn't just surviving, it was staying. Shadow never left Daniel's side after that night. The woods became their shared space, long walks turning into an unspoken routine. Shadow trotted ahead, ears alert, occasionally pausing to glance back, as if waiting for him to catch up. At the riverbank, Daniel tossed a stick. Shadow watched it land, then turned back to him, unimpressed. "Not a retriever, huh?" Daniel smirked. Instead, Shadow circled back to the clearing, nose pressed to the earth. The same spot, the same digging. Daniel sighed. Whatever Shadow was searching for, it wasn't just instinct. It was something deeper, something that still haunted the dog. But trust was growing between them. And maybe, just maybe, one day, Shadow would let him in completely. Shadow had become more than a stray. It was a guardian. At night, it slept at the foot of Daniel's bed, ears twitching at every sound. During the day, it walked beside him, a quiet but constant presence. One evening, Daniel stepped outside, stretching after a long day. The air was crisp, the woods peaceful, until a rustling sound made him turn. A coyote, lurking near the tree line. Daniel barely had time to react before a shadow leapt forward, a growl ripping from its throat. The coyote hesitated, then bolted. Daniel exhaled shakily, looking down at Shadow. "You're protecting me now, huh?" he murmured. Shadow simply sat at his feet, eyes locked on the darkened woods. Whatever past had shaped this dog, one thing was certain. Shadow had chosen Daniel, and it wasn't leaving. One night something changed. Shadow wasn't digging. Instead, it stood motionless, staring at Daniel with deep, sorrowful eyes. Its body trembled slightly, a low whimper escaping its throat. Daniel crouched beside it, his heart tightening. "Shadow? What is it?" The dog didn't look away. Instead, it pressed its nose against the ground, then lifted its head, watching, waiting. A silent plea. Daniel swallowed hard, fingers curling into the dirt. He hesitated, then began to dig. Beneath the cold earth, something solid met his touch. Wood? A box. Shadow let out a soft, pained whine, pressing closer to Daniel. His pulse pounded. Whatever was inside, it was the answer to Shadow's past. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to finally uncover the truth. Daniel wiped the sweat from his brow, his breath heavy as he watched Shadow claw furiously at the damp earth. The dog's persistence had gone beyond mere habit. It was a desperate plea. Daniel clenched his jaw, grabbed a shovel, and stepped forward. "All right, boy. Let's see what you've been trying to show me." The first thrust of the shovel into the soil sent a chill through him. Shadow paused for a moment, watching intently before resuming his frantic digging. The dirt was looser here, disturbed repeatedly over time. As Daniel dug deeper, unease twisted in his gut. Then, thud, the shovel struck something solid. Daniel's breath hitched. Shadow whined, pacing in small, anxious circles. Whatever was buried here, it was important, and Daniel was about to find out why. Daniel knelt, brushing dirt away with trembling hands. A wooden box, aged and weathered, lay half buried beneath the soil. It wasn't large, but something about it felt heavy, as if it carried the weight of time itself. Shadow let out a low whimper, nudging the box with his nose. Daniel hesitated before lifting the fragile lid. A wave of dust rose into the air, revealing its contents: faded, crumpled papers and an old, worn-out dog collar. The collar's tag had rusted, but faint engravings remained. He traced his fingers over the name etched into the metal: Shadow. His heart pounded. This wasn't just a random spot. Shadow had been leading him to something deeply personal, something buried not just in the earth but in the past. Daniel carefully pulled the papers from the box. They weren't just scraps. They were letters, their ink smudged, their edges frayed from age and exposure. His fingers trembled as he unfolded the first one. "To my best friend, Shadow." His chest tightened. The handwriting was uneven, a child's scrawl filled with innocent affection. He flipped through the letters. Each one spoke of daily adventures, bedtime cuddles, and whispered secrets. A girl had once loved Shadow more than anything. Shadow whined softly, pressing his head against Daniel's arm, as if remembering. Daniel swallowed hard. This wasn't just a buried box. It was a memory, a story that had been left unfinished. And Shadow, after all this time, had never stopped searching for the one who had once called him family. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. Shadow hadn't always been a stray. He had belonged to someone, a little girl whose words were now nothing more than faded ink on forgotten pages. Daniel ran his thumb over one of the letters, his mind racing. "Where did she go, buddy?" he murmured, glancing at Shadow. The dog's ears perked, his dark eyes filled with something Daniel could only describe as sorrow. Shadow had been waiting, digging, searching, not for shelter, not for comfort, but for her. But there was one thing the letters didn't say. What had happened to her? Daniel's grip tightened on the papers. If Shadow had never stopped searching, it meant the story wasn't over. Not yet. Daniel read each letter with growing unease. The girl's words were joyful at first, filled with love for her dog, excitement for the future. But then the tone shifted. "Shadow, Daddy says I have to stay inside. I don't like it here. It's dark, and Mommy cries a lot, but I know you'll find me if I get lost." Daniel's stomach turned. The last letter was the shortest. A few words hurriedly scribbled. "Shadow, I'm scared." And then nothing. No more letters, no more pages, just silence. Shadow let out a low whimper, pawing at the ground again. Daniel clenched his fists, his pulse hammering in his ears. Something terrible had happened here, and somehow Shadow had never given up trying to find the answers. Daniel scanned the area with new eyes. Shadow hadn't been digging randomly. He had been trying to return. Daniel lifted the last letter again. The words echoed in his mind. "I don't like it here. It's dark." A thought struck him. Could she have been trapped? He turned slowly, looking at the clearing, the trees, the uneven ground. Then, about 10 feet away, he noticed something. The edge of an old rotting wooden board, barely visible beneath layers of dirt and leaves. A basement? A cellar? His breath caught in his throat. Shadow wasn't just searching. He was leading Daniel to the last place she had been seen. And whatever was down there, it had been hidden for a long time. Daniel's fingers trembled as he brushed away the leaves, revealing a wooden hatch. The hinges were rusted, the wood splintered with age. He pulled, and with a groan of protest, the door creaked open. Darkness, stale air, a chill crept down his spine. Shadow hesitated, then let out a sharp, urgent bark. Daniel's chest tightened. He didn't know what he was expecting, but he knew, deep down, that this wasn't just an old cellar. He turned back to the letters, to the desperate final words of a child who had vanished without a trace. This wasn't just Shadow's search anymore. This was an unsolved case. And Daniel was about to step straight into it. Daniel's hand shook as he pulled out his phone. He dialed with numb fingers, his voice unsteady. "I think I found something. Something tied to an old missing person case." The dispatcher's voice sharpened. "Stay where you are. We're sending officers." Shadow let out a soft, low whine, pressing close to Daniel's side. The dog had never stopped looking, never stopped believing that his girl was out there somewhere. Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat. If there was even a chance that this could bring closure to an old tragedy, then Shadow's devotion had not been in vain. As the distant sound of sirens echoed through the trees, Daniel placed a hand on Shadow's head. "You never gave up, did you?" And for the first time, Shadow stopped digging. The weight of Shadow's discovery sent ripples through the quiet town. Authorities, initially skeptical, now found themselves combing through the long-forgotten case files. The box, with its faded collar and letters, wasn't just an artifact, it was a thread leading to something bigger. Detectives revisited old reports, cross-referencing them with Shadow's find. Then a chilling realization struck. A crucial detail had been overlooked all those years ago. A witness had once mentioned seeing a dog digging frantically near the very spot where Daniel had found the box. But back then, no one thought it mattered. Now, with new technology and fresh eyes, investigators uncovered overlooked footprints, small, like a child's, preserved beneath years of untouched soil. It was the break the case needed. Word spread quickly, reaching a family that had been trapped in unanswered grief. The missing girl's parents, now aged, had spent decades wondering, hoping, fearing the worst. When the authorities arrived at their doorstep with the newly uncovered evidence, emotions ran high. The confirmation they received wasn't the one they had prayed for, but it was something. They finally knew what had happened. Their little girl had been here, in this very place, on that fateful day. The uncertainty that had tormented them was now replaced by bittersweet closure. As they visited the site where she had last been, Shadow watched them, his amber eyes filled with something deep, understanding. For years, Shadow had been driven by an instinctive, unrelenting search. Every hole he dug, every restless night under the moon, it had all been for her. But now, as he sat beside Daniel, the truth had settled within him. He no longer needed to dig. The past, once an open wound, was finally healing. Shadow let out a deep sigh, the kind Daniel had never heard before, one of release, of letting go. It wasn't immediate, but something in the dog had changed. For the first time in years, he turned away from the past and looked ahead. Not to the earth beneath him, but to the man beside him. Daniel had once thought of Shadow as a puzzle, a mystery waiting to be solved. But now, he saw him for what he truly was, a soul searching for belonging. The decision was unspoken but clear. Shadow wouldn't be alone anymore. Back at Daniel's cabin, Shadow hesitated at the doorstep, looking back once, perhaps a final goodbye to the life he had known. Then he stepped inside. Days turned into weeks, and the restless, haunted dog began to transform. He slept soundly by the fireplace, played in the fields without worry, and even started greeting Daniel with a wagging tail. Shadow hadn't just found a home. He had found family. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Shadow wandered to the old oak tree, the place where his search had once consumed him. But this time, he didn't dig. Instead, he simply lay down, his eyes soft, his body relaxed. Daniel watched, his heart swelling at the sight. Shadow wasn't searching anymore. He had found his place, his peace. And as he rested there, the wind carried a whisper through the trees, one that only Shadow could understand. That night, Shadow curled up beside Daniel, his head resting on the man's lap. No words were spoken, none were needed. Daniel ran a hand through the thick fur, feeling the steady rise and fall of Shadow's breath. A silent understanding passed between them, one of loyalty, of healing, of an unbreakable bond that would last a lifetime. As Daniel sat on the porch, his fingers idly stroking Shadow's thick fur, he realized something. Love, real love, never fades. The past had left its scars, both on Shadow and himself. Yet, here they were, together, healing in ways they never thought possible. Shadow's search for the girl had been his entire world. But in losing that purpose, he had found another, Daniel. And Daniel, who once believed love was fleeting, now knew better. Love wasn't just about presence. It was about memories, about carrying the ones we've lost in our hearts and honoring them with the love we still have to give. Daniel had taken Shadow in, believing he was saving a lost soul. But in truth, it was Shadow who had saved him. Before Shadow, Daniel's world had been quiet, empty. He had lived without truly living. But Shadow had brought purpose, companionship, and a love so unwavering that it softened even the hardest edges of his past. Some rescues aren't just about taking in the broken. They're about letting the broken heal you, about realizing that sometimes the ones we think need saving are the ones who save us the most. The wind carried the scent of pine through the open field where Daniel and Shadow walked. No leash, no commands, just an understanding that ran deeper than words. They had been through storms, through loss, through moments that should have broken them. And yet, they remained. Some bonds weren't meant to fade. They endured, etched into the soul, stronger than time, stronger than pain. Shadow turned, pressing his head against Daniel's leg, and Daniel smiled. This was the kind of love that never disappeared. Life moved forward, as it always did. Seasons would change, and time would pass, but some things remained constant. The need for love, for connection, for belonging. Shadow had spent years searching, and in the end, he had found what he wasn't even looking for. A home, a family, a second chance. Because no matter where the road leads, love always finds a way.